my hands. And every now and again, I see my hands swapping in front. That's why I turn off my camera. But I'll talk for a little bit with the camera on. So again, we want you to pull in the resources that we provide you guys, and we want to also, encourage you to go out to the GitHub site to pull in all that good, publicly accessible, downloadable with slides and scripts with the instructions for the lab setup. We want you to go through that. Again, goals for the workshop. I'll build the slide out. We want you, this lab session, the workshop session is interactive, right? Ask a question. You have a problem. Ping me in between user group meetings or meetup meetings to say, hey, I have a question. Hopefully you have a chance to kind of think about why you might want to evaluate, why you might want to upgrade to SQL Server. Take a look at specific features. That's really what this workshop is about, right? It's specific features that you get hands-on experience in trying, or at least get to see, at the very least, see me demo them, and then, walk away with these resources. And the resources here on the SQL Server 22 workshop link are amazing. Again, the meetup times, we're doing these the last Friday of every month through October. Then we'll do an early November kind of a Q&A, what we learned session. And that might not even be a full hour, right? That, might be, who knows how long that'll be. But we try to take apart the workshop. The workshop's intended to be delivered in a day. Well, I'll show you the workshop here in a moment. So we broke apart these modules into either a one per month, or one module split across 2 months. Right now, we're in the back end of module 2, connections to Azure, which we'll talk about the map, the hybridization of SQL Server, and how SQL Server 22 is really a big statement on hybrid connectivity. And then next month, we'll talk about built-in query intelligence. Kind of what I was talking about with David about just now is really I haven't had to tune a query by myself in a long time. And that's because of things like built-in query intelligence. Then we'll spend 2 months on scalability, security, scalability, and availability. And then we'll go into September with data virtualization and object storage. And then October, we'll talk about enhancing our applications with new T-SQL capabilities. Side note, I'm supposed to be in Boston the last weekend of September, I think. So if I'm not in, well, no, I'll deliver this from the hotel either way. But I've got to go up for my master's degree program. We've got an on-campus weekend, and I think it's going to be the last weekend in September. But it shouldn't affect us too much. We'll just be delivering over crappy Wi-Fi. We still have this is still in play. This is our meetup, kind of an event, a 6-hour event, covering Azure, OpenAI, and ChatGPT, roughly titled Azure, OpenAI, and ChatGPT Bootcamp. We're partnering with some other organizations that do kind of 501c3 work. So Prashant, has the ticket out for this yet?
Not yet. We haven't opened the ticket yet. Still working
Okay.
on some backend logistics,
Okay.
but tune out for the announcement early June, both via the meetup as well as some other mechanisms as well.
Yeah, I'll blanket right there. I'll email past attendees of past events over Eventbrite. I'll ping meetup for my meetup, and then for the 40 other meetups that I'm a part of, I'll ping Twitter, LinkedIn, so people will know about this event. We're trying to get 120 attendees. It is going to be paid simply because, well, a reason is, pizza is a horrible thing to waste, right? We don't want to have wasted pizza because of no shows. That's one thing. And the other reason is, Prashant attended an in-person event that was, less than, 40% of the registrant. So we want to avoid that. So we think that if we charge a fee, it's a small fee, but it still makes you think, I don't want to, like if you bought a movie ticket, you have to Fast X. My wife and I went to see that on Monday. Very good movie. It leaves you hanging though. I won't spoil it if you're a Fast and Furious fan. It leaves you hanging. I'll just say that. I'll just say that. I'm sure you read the reviews. But let's say you had a movie ticket and you bought that movie ticket and you know you want to go see the movie, but on the morning of the movie, you're like, well, it'll be about the price of a movie ticket, right? It's not going to be $100 or $50, but it'll kind of relate to the cost of, you know, food and drink for that day. That's all it is. We're just trying to kind of tie that in. And again, anyway, it's going to be a single track event from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. We'll have some great speakers. I think Prashant has some sponsors lined up. If you know Frank Levine or Frank Lavigne, who is an AI machine learning specialist who used to work for Microsoft, but he's lined in to speak. Plus, we've got some other good speakers, and we're also hosting it. We're hosting it in Reston, but it's not at our usual place in 12012 Sunset Hills. It's off of Freedom Drive, kind of right next to Morton's in the Reston Town Center. So come on out. It'll be fun. And I've been to our new facility there at Freedom Square, and it's very nice. And I believe Prashant's been there. It's very nice, good coffee and all that. And we'll have the room and the floor set up for the announced as part of the ticket. All right. Again, everything for this meetup, uh, we're recording it right now. So you'll be able to pull the recording from aka.ms cloud events. And that's our fancy little URL there for our YouTube channel. All of our meetups for the past couple of years have been posted there. And then our virtual sessions for our events have been posted there for most of them. Prashant and I tried to do a session. We tried to do an event a couple of years ago, and instead of having to chop up and do each meeting, do each event session, we just let the recording run from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. and then we we couldn't figure out a good way to chop up the session. So anyway, everything but maybe that piece is on the YouTube channel, and then of course you can go out at any time to the YouTube channel, of course. But you can also go out to the GitHub channel, GitHub site. And again, we've provided this link out here a bunch of times, but I always like to go back out to it, right? It's the SQL workshop, SQL Server 20, or SQL 2022 workshop. It's got everything you need. It's got sort of an overview of the workshop and the technologies used and what you would need to do to kind of get spun up. The client connectivity tools, and then the modules that we're covering. And then you can go and the slides I'm using and the slides that David's used and the slides that we've presented internally are all based off of these slides. So you can go in and oops, sorry about that. You can go into the workshop itself, and there's a slides subdirectory that, yeah, they got updated last week. The slides that we're looking at got updated in April, so I'll probably incorporate this updated deck into the deck that we use for June. But go out because I don't send out slides after this meeting. There's no repository to go look at slides. Come here to get your slides. And then the workshop itself, if you want to go and do the labs with me, there's the Azure Active Directory lab, the Azure Arc Extension lab, the MI Link lab, the Purview integration. Again, Purview is a little bit more complicated, right? You might want to just take a look at Purview, and then the Synapse Link lab. Those are all the connected scenarios that we've talked about. We talked about half of them last April or in April. We talked about the managed instance link, and we talked about um, Azure Arc Extension and Synapse link, I believe. So today we're going to talk about Azure Active Directory and Purview. So we're not going to beat ourselves up too much today. But anyway, go out to this. Also, there's a really good YouTube channel that covers all of the SQL Server 22 content, and that's Anna Hoffman and Bob Ward doing these videos. Well, it's mostly Bob Ward. There's some other people in the space, like what is his name? David Pless there, I see, and one other person. But anyway, go take a look. It's all good stuff. There's like 9 videos for SQL Server 22. Plus, Bob Ward also has a book for SQL Server 22 Revealed. So you might want to go check out the book. I used the book to prep these lectures. And I use the book for our internal lectures. I use the book for customer facing type, because it's written by Bob Ward, our Microsoft product group, SQL guru. And it's a good way for you to get prepped up. I have this book. I bought this book on Kindle, but I have his Azure SQL book behind me. And it's a good book as well. All right. There's a copy of his book. So now let's dig into the chapter. I'm going to turn off my camera real quick. Bye, everybody. I'm just going to turn off my camera. You're not being delivered a session by an AI robot. Although that day is coming, don't you think? Pretty soon you're just going to go blip. Yeah, George, on the URL, we don't have the ticket yet. So once we get the tickets posted, then we'll send out the URL. Absolutely. So the workshop again is broken down, and I encourage you to go take a look at these slides below. There's a workshop, with the workshop GitHub. There's the YouTube, and then there's his demos. And you can if you want further information. There's a lot more demos that are configured out there with instructions on how to do the demo. So if you need to do, at the very least, a proof of concept, some type of build up about these technologies, you go to the SQL Server 22 demos link, and you can pull that up. I'll actually do that. I believe it's a OneDrive section. Hold on one second. Yeah, it links out to GitHub. So there's all types of demos here for all the different topics we're going to cover. Plus other little things that are like little hidden nuggets that we don't really cover in the workshop, or Kubernetes or SQL on Kubernetes. More drilled out, more deeper labs, I would say, on the demo section. So go out there, go download this slide deck and really kind of dig into it. We kind of get out of this piece. All right, now just quickly, I want to just kind of go over, I just kind of reset. I know we go over this, we'll kind of go over this every workshop, right? Every one of these workshops will cover, there's 2 or 3 base slides that talks about SQL Server 22, but from the perspective of where we came from for 2016, 2017, and 2019, and how things have gotten more more integrated with the hybrid platforms, with integrating your on-prem environment to your cloud environment, and making sure that things operate smoothly, and then incorporating architecture, right? In SQL Server 2016, you're able to run a backup and have that backup to run to a URL, and then back up to Azure Blob storage. And then you're also able to have a node in a SQL Server on an Azure virtual machine, in an availability group, always on availability group. And then with SQL Server 2017, we introduced, the ability to run SQL Server workloads on Azure hosts, on Linux hosts, and also in containers. And then we also introduced adaptive query processing and automatic tuning and graph database machine learning services. And then in 2019, more data virtualization, hitting external data sources with external tables, and being able to leverage Polybase, but strengthen the Polybase capabilities. Intelligent query processing. Actually, intelligent query processing, that story can be told from 2016, 2017, and 2019. We have a nice map that shows the different capabilities and how they were plugged in per version. And then data classification in 2016 or 2019 as well, to look at your data and determine whether or not it should be classified at a certain level. Now, Microsoft Purview does data classification, does glossary, does data categorization. You can have labeling of your data they can all be configured at Purview and then pushed down onto your SQL Server 22 environment. We'll talk about that. And then we've talked about a need to do this breadth of offering of your relational database management, all the way from the edge of your network for IoT devices with running Azure SQL Edge, all the way to the cloud itself in the enterprise with Azure SQL database. And in between, right, there's SQL Server 22, SQL Server on Linux, containers, Kubernetes, and then to really bake in to Azure itself, we have the Azure Arc enabled SQL servers, which brings in the ability to manage your SQL Server 22 installation, whether it's on-prem or on a Azure virtual machine. But ideally, if it's on-prem, you install the Azure Arc enabled extension, and you can do things like get best practices. You can leverage pay-as-you-go licensing. You can do Azure Active Directory authentication. You can integrate it with Microsoft Purview. We'll talk about those things today specifically. And then same with Azure Arc enabled managed instance, SQL servers running on Azure virtual machines. SQL servers running on Azure virtual machines have have an IaaS agent extension that can do the same thing that Arc enabled SQL servers can do. Like Arc enabled SQL servers would be on prem. An IaaS extension agent would be, or agent extension would be on a SQL Server workload that's running on an Azure virtual machine. What's good about all these different agents is they allow you to be in Azure and go into your blade that's got all of your nodes. I won't even say servers, because could have Azure SQL databases or managed instances or um, um, uh, but yeah, all your Azure footprint, your Azure database footprint. You can see them in one blade. You can see your Azure SQL databases. You can see your Azure Arc enabled SQL servers. You can see your SQL servers that are running on Azure virtual machines. You can see your managed instances all in one pane of glass. Or you can break it up into, get it more granular on the filtering, but it still allows you to see that. And we're providing the flexibility, the tools are the same, right? It's all hitting it with Azure Data Studio or Visual Studio or SQL Server Management Studio. Build the slide out. Hold on. And we have these hero capabilities for SQL Server 22 that we're stressing, and this is the connections to Azure piece specifically. That's what we're talking about for for the April session and for today's session. Where there's the link feature for managed instances. That's where you basically can have a SQL Server 22 installation on-prem or on a virtual machine, and it has a connection to an Azure SQL managed instance. And you're basically replicating data. It creates an always on availability group. It creates a distributed availability group, and it creates that asynchronous replication from your primary node, which is SQL Server 22, to your secondary node, which is Azure SQL managed instance. And you can fail over to your Azure SQL managed instance. And you could choose on failover, right, to tear apart your availability group or your data distributed availability group. That's all fine. Those are choices you can make. And you can also do a forced failover, which will basically, you're going to lose data because you haven't fully waited for synchronization. Something probably bad has happened in the area where you're hosting your primary node. And then we've got the ability to push operational data into Azure Data Lake Gen 2 storage and let an integrated runtime environment push that into an Azure Synapse SQL pool to do analytics over that operational data in near real time, not real time, but near real time with minimal latency with Azure Synapse Link. So Link feature for managed instance and Synapse Link are two very cool new features. Now the Link feature for managed instance, that's available in Microsoft or in SQL Server 2016, 2019, and as well as 22. I don't know about 2017. I didn't see that explicitly listed, but there's documentation I think we took a look at in April, but I'll make sure I paste the link here when we wrap up. And then Microsoft Purview integration, which is kind of what we're going to talk about today. Now, what Purview does when you add the Azure Arc Extension agent, then you can do Azure Active Directory authentication, which is important because That gives you another way to authenticate, right? You can authenticate with SQL authentication if you got mixed mode running. You can authenticate with an Azure Active Directory login to log into your SQL Server 22 nodes. But you got to be configured with this Azure Arc extension. And then with Purview, you can create policies and pull in insights and take a look at data lineage. But we'll take a look at Purview from a policy perspective, where you can build a policy in Purview for certain levels of data access, and then that's it. You can or cannot, access data based on the policy configured in Purview that's been pushed down to SQL Server 22 because of the Azure Arc enabled extension. And then we've got some security features that we'll talk about in a couple of months. One of which is Ledger for SQL Server using Bitcoin technology to make sure that we can track or prevent changes to a table. We can see who did it, when they did it, why they did it, and exactly what activity was taken. And then built-in query intelligence. We'll talk about that next month. And then that's kind of on our platform. We've got SQL, Azure SQL Edge, and Azure Arc-enabled data services, and then Azure SQL Database all on the cloud. Now, SQL Server 22 capabilities. Let me build this slide out. Yeah, sorry. Sometimes I don't know how far the slide is going to build, so I might go past it. Again, this is how we're breaking up our workshop. And I know we, um, probably cut up half the time here. But if you take a look at the cloud connected piece, which is where we're going to wrap up today, then we'll talk about built-in query intelligence, security and scalability and availability. On things like contained availability groups, we'll talk about that next or in a couple of months. We'll talk about scalability and security. We'll talk about data virtualization and object storage to be able to store or do backups onto an Amazon S3 file space. We'll talk about the T-SQL enhancements for time series data, for accessing JSON data, and also the T-SQL operational surface. We'll talk about those. Now today, I know we only have 35 minutes or so, and that's completely fine. I just want to kind of refresh where we've gone and what we're going to talk about. We talked about last week or last month. We talked about some of the hybrid capability of SQL Server 22. We talked about managed disaster recovery with managed instance, where you can fail over and you can also fail back from your managed instance node to your SQL Server 22 node. You can also do a backup, a copy-only backup from your Azure SQL Managed Instance node and restore that copy-only backup from your Azure SQL Managed Instance onto a SQL Server 22 node, and that's done with the database version. It's the version of an Azure SQL Managed Instance database is 957. And guess what? SQL Server 22 can take a restore of a 957 version database. Now, I've had a customer or two say that they've been able to restore it onto SQL Server 2019. That's just kind of a rumor in the wind on that. I'm not exactly sure. I haven't tested it myself. I just heard that, and that's unofficial. Tim, not a Microsoft employee. I'm just some babbling idiot you see on a city corner for that comment. And then we talked about near real-time analytics with Synapse Link, where you push data from an Azure SQL, from SQL Server 22 operational data onto a landing zone. That landing zone has Azure Data Lake Gen 2 storage in it and an integrated runtime engine to look at updates and then push those updates into the Azure Synapse SQL pool, and then you can get that near real-time data from your SQL Server 22 that's been pushed to your SQL pool and Azure Synapse Link or over the Azure Synapse Link, and then you can expose that to analytical reports. Also, we talked about Azure Arc-enabled server and how you can get, Microsoft Defender capabilities and inventory capabilities and see the server from Azure. And some of the benefit, you can get Azure Active Directory. You can also get integrated into Microsoft Purview. So now let's talk about those today. And again, SQL Server really has it always been hybrid? You could argue that it mostly has, right? Because with SQL 2016, you were able to, back up to a URL and all that stuff, and back up to cloud storage and restore from cloud storage. And I I believe earlier versions as well. But anyway, there's just been this move toward hybridization, primarily with things like SQL Server workloads that run on Azure virtual machines, Azure managed instance, Azure SQL managed instance, and then the Azure SQL database. There's hybrid connectivity with that, with Azure SQL database around a technology called Azure Data Sync, where you can include in your sync topology on-prem SQL Server workloads as well as Azure SQL databases. And then you can also include an Azure SQL database. I'd have to check. I was going to say something about transactional replication, but I always want to make sure, so I won't say it. And then we've got always on availability groups and replication technologies and link servers backing up to URL for the hybrid capabilities. And then with the cloud connectivity, again, with Azure SQL managed instance, with the ability to link to an Azure SQL managed instance for replication and failover, data changes with Azure Synapse Analytics, authentication with Azure Active Directory, access policies with Microsoft Purview, uh, Microsoft Defender for SQL, being able to enlist and roll your SQL Server 22 workloads into the Microsoft Defender is pretty powerful stuff, because you can get vulnerability assessments and real-time alerts and do remediation and baselining for that. And that's all part of your Azure Arc enabled piece. And also part of that is inventory and pay-as-you-go billing and best practices analysis. So let me go, hold on one second. Sorry about that. Let me scooch down to get past go into this. Good old Teams. So now let's talk about securing our SQL Server 22 with Azure Active Directory. I know we're getting to this right at the middle of the meetup, but it's not that long of a section to brief. Securing your SQL Server 22 with Azure Active Directory authentication, with Microsoft Purview and Microsoft Defender, right? If you're not familiar with what Purview is a very powerful tool. I know I already kind of mentioned it earlier, but it does classification. It does data. It crawls across, um, all the Azure data sources. It crawls across GCP, AWS, on-prem, wherever it has permissions to crawl and do data discovery, it'll do it. It'll do data classification. It'll do, key contacts for your data. It'll map out the schema of your data. Also from Purview, you can integrate, with a click of a button, you can pull in, Power BI to do visualizations from the data source that you're looking at. Um, you can have policies configured in Purview, which is kind of what we're going to talk about today. And then there's Microsoft Defender for SQL, and that's where you can pull in the vulnerability analysis, and that's very helpful, and get real-time alerts about your SQL Server 22 platform. Now, Azure Active Directory for SQL Server, again, the reason you would configure this is if you've got maybe some alternative for authentication to your SQL Server 22 boxes, other than SQL authentication and other than Windows authentication. So you would go and do the Azure extension for SQL Server. I believe there could be a registry hack you have to do for the Azure Active Directory for SQL Server piece with the mssql.conf part of the Hive, I believe. I'll check on that. And then you add the Azure extension for SQL Server as part of that configuration, and then you should be able to have an Azure Active Directory authentication. And it does that by knowing it's a part of an Azure network by when you install SQL Server, Yeah, again, you can do this before or after. It's easy to do before, but when you install SQL Server 22, there is an Azure extension for SQL Server installation window that will take your login information, or right, if you're going to use a service principal, it'll take in the subscription and the resource group and the region, all the basic Azure information. So it will enroll you into your Azure tenant as a managed node. By the way, there's a link up here at the top around Azure Active Directory for SQL Server. So take a look at that. And then you can be a part of the Azure Active Directory. And then you can do things like, if you've got multi-factor authentication configured for users that log into your Azure Active Directory, you can get that. It absolutely requires the Azure Arc extension on that. Um, you could use it for users that have or don't have logins, or maybe they, as part of their process for getting access to the SQL Server. So, and then also, if you are going to configure a link server, you can also use Azure Active Directory login for connecting to a link server. I would assume that link server would either be going to an Azure SQL database, an Azure SQL managed instance, or I don't know about downstream. I'll check on that. And then there's an Azure Active Directory login. It's going to get you into SQL Server. Once you've got the Azure extension in place, once Azure Active Directory sees that node, then you can begin to use your Azure Active Directory login to access your SQL Server 22 node that's been, you've got that user or group's been granted access to that SQL Server through their Azure Active Directory membership. And then you can have this on SQL Server 22 and also SQL Server that might be running on an Azure virtual machine as well. And then here's a quick demo on the Azure Active Directory login. It's going to be me reciting the demo, but the demo is actually a recording that was done by Bob Ward and the gang. Let's go here. And then here we've got the demo here. We've got our Azure Active Directory. We're going to set our Azure Active Directory admin, and that's our SQL Server, Azure Active Directory, SQL Server, but we're going to add the SQL Server Azure Active Directory admin to our SQL Server, and you can do things from here like do service registration, server app registration, and Microsoft Purview access policies. And then here is an example of adding a login, but we're going to log in. We're going to add an Azure Active Directory user called Anna Hoffman to the sysadmin role. Again, we're going to create the login. We're going to add her to a role. So there's the Azure Active Directory piece. And now you can see that Anna does have a login, an Azure Active Directory login from SQL Server. Hold on one second. So that's that. Hold on one second. Sorry about that, guys. I was getting kind of squished. Then here is an example of logging in to Azure Active Directory with the login screen on the SQL Server Management Studio to logging into the BW SQL Server 22 with an Azure Active Directory password or integrated or service principal or managed ID. She's going to connect as an Azure Active Directory user. You can see the connection there. Okay. Oh, sorry. And here we can see a user, an Azure Active Directory user, being created inside of a database from external provider, right? It's the Azure Active Directory executing. We were able to create that database or access that database. And now we're going to log in to the server, or attempt to log into the server. Logged into the server is that Azure Active Directory user with our and access our database from here. An example of directly adding a user that doesn't have a server login onto the data, similar to, if you're familiar with the concept of a contained user, similar to that. So that's Azure Active Directory, and I'll provide some links around, the benefits to that. Or I'll provide the link from the slide. All right, now Purview integration. I'm sorry. Purview integration is very interesting. You can pull information about your server, about your databases on the server. You can see lineage, so you can see the source of that data, if there's been any transformations, the impact of that data, which is also really helpful. Like, oh, we need to get rid of this database, no one's using it. You can see the impact report from that database and say, ooh, this is being used by, 4 different Power BI dashboards and reports, and we'd have to reach out to those users to see if we can take it down. So it provides the insights, lineage, and governance over your entire data estate to include SQL Server 22. So the challenge, right? I need central insights and governance across all of my SQL data, right? So that does automatically, it'll scan all your on-prem SQL servers and pulls in that metadata. It captures data about the data, the metadata. It'll do classification of the data that it imports. No, it doesn't import any data other than metadata. Let me get that clear. But it does classification. If you have sensitive columns, things that are, person PII related or HIPAA related or credit card related, it'll pull that, it'll classify it for you. And then those labels, if you do a data extract or move the data somewhere else or pull the data into Power BI, those labels follow the data. Just like in Power BI, if you've got a highly classified report and you're going to do an export of the data into a spreadsheet, that label for that highly classified data will follow. If you're allowed to export, it'll follow the data. It'll stay in the Excel spreadsheet. You can also track that lineage for usage and dependencies, these impacts on dashboards and reports. Then you can do setup and control specific rights and accesses with the SQL Server with different policies that you can set up. And again, with the policies for SQL Server with Purview, sorry about that. With Purview, these policies, you publish a policy from Purview. It works only with Azure Active Directory accounts, right? So an Azure Active Directory account that's logging into a server, they would be hit by a Microsoft Purview policy, and Purview would tell them, direct what they could do or restrict what they can do or grant what they can do. The engine understands the policies. And when it sees the login, that's when it grants the permissions. It integrates the policies with standard logins and permissions as well. And then it works across multiple SQL instances. Then you could, it remove policy removes the authentication. So if you drop the policy, it'll also remove any type of basically authentication configuration you did to get that working in the first place. But there's a data policy around being able to read or modify, and then there's DevOps around taking a look at the data, monitoring, and auditing. The policy architecture itself, let me just kind of talk you through this slide. The first step here, right? You like we've seen before, we're going to register our SQL Server, as an ARC-enabled SQL Server and then enable Azure Active Directory authentication. Then we're going to enable Purview, which writes information into the registry or the mssql.conf file. And then step two, we're going to register SQL Server in Purview Studio and then create data and/or DevOps policies. And then three, SQL Server uses information in the registry to extract policy information from Purview and then store this information in a policy cache in a system table metadata. And then for four, then there's an Azure Active Directory logon that tries to connect to SQL Server. Then SQL Server uses that Azure Active Directory authentication and looks at the policy cache to determine if the Azure Active Directory account can connect via the policies, and then applies the permissions based on the policy itself. All right, so let's take a demo at the Microsoft Purview access policies. I think these demo screens might be a little bit more convoluted. Oh boy, hold on one second. One second. Let's take a look at Purview access policies. So this is the Purview screen. That's where you've got a connected SQL Server here, and you can see Microsoft Purview, and it's a testing screen really. And we can see the source is an ARC-enabled SQL Server, and there's an endpoint, right? There's the server name. It's leveraging the data management piece. We're allowing data access policies to be assigned. So that's the big piece, right? You're connecting and then you're telling your SQL Server itself that we can. Did I go to there? Hold on one second. Oh, sorry about that, guys. And then here's your Azure Active Directory screen. You can go to Azure Active Directory. And then here, looking at what is the access for this SQL Server 22 box for Microsoft Purview. It's underneath Purview. It tells you the Purview endpoint and tells you that the ARC agent refresh status is successful. So one, in the previous slide, we looked at making sure from the Azure Purview screen that Purview can see the server, and this is simply going into the server, the SQL Server 22 blade, and then looking at Azure Active Directory, then looking at the Purview access policy to see this in fact integrated into Purview. And then here, back in Purview, we've got data access policies. Again, I believe this feature is still in preview. We've got your data access policies. New policy. SQL readers. New policy statement. This will affect this a type of action on these data sources, and you put your data source types, Azure Arc enabled SQL servers on these certain subjects. Then you can search by user groups or email groups or specific users. Then apply the policy, create the policy. And now you can see SQL readers, kind of look at the policy itself. You can do some edits on the policy. And it's saying allow read on data contained in this SQL Server to this specific principal. And you can see that policy is now tied into this data source, and you can publish this policy. So it's going to publish this policy for you. And you can go then and check on the whether or not the policy itself worked. You can be logged in here as the the essay of the box, not the Marissa Matthews that we just looked at. see in our policy cache and our policy state description, the policy is ready to be used. And then here we can go in and see that if we do a connection, and we do a connection with that person that would be affected as a reader for the policy, they can go in, open up the database, like normal mode of operation. They can read from the database, right? They're, select from the database, no problem. They shouldn't be able to write from the database. Oh, they can't drop the table. So you can't drop the table. You can't make a modification to the database because of the Purview policy. And then you can also do DevOps policies. New policy for DevOps. Azure Arc enabled servers on this, the data source name that you want to apply the policy to. Security performance or SQL performance or SQL security auditor. Put the user in there. Anna Hoffman. Add remove subjects. But create the policy. And so you've got a brand new DevOps policy here. Then here, in terms of kicking off the policy, you can see you can log in, database. You can log in with MFA or with the account that with Anna's account, we just want to make sure she's affected by the policy. Hit connect. Hit new query. She wants to maybe look at some performance information, and she can do that. She can look at performance information. She can run let's see if she can run the Speak Advanced. She doesn't have permissions, right? She's got permission to do some things, but not all things as part of the policy. And then another little take on DevOps policies here. Can go in and delete a policy and sort of refresh the cache with this deletion. And then go in and now see if she can run that statement. And now she can't even log into the SQL servers, right? Because you deleted the policy and that deletes the logins as well. Then here we've got SQL Server open. We've got some, some policy type statements that you can do some additional checking if you had to troubleshoot policies or you're trying to, figure out what needs to. Oh, sorry. Need to figure out the policies and do some additional troubleshooting. We have some views. Again, policies deleted. Deletes login. Sorry about that. I didn't mean to screw you up. And again, this is the same slide, right? It's our different slide. This is more around DMVs that you could use to troubleshoot the policy and the policy cache. So policy principals, policy role members, and policy principal assigned actions can help you kind of do some additional troubleshooting on the policies. All right. All right. Any questions about those? These demos are available for you to download also, so you can go and take a look at the demos as well. Also, real quick, let me close with a little bit on Microsoft Defender. Again, I don't have a demo for Defender, but again, the Defender adds that additional layer of database protection, and you can leverage this with the Arc enabled extension. And then you can have SQL Server 22 on-prem installations protected by the power of Microsoft Azure and all the, the cloud muscle. So if you want to leverage Microsoft Defender for Cloud, install the Azure Arc extension agent, and then you're good to go. One-click enablement of protect different types of workloads. It's literally that, right? You go into Azure SQL or Azure IaaS. You can go into SQL Server 22 and enable all these enable Defender, and you can see what your security posture is on your SQL Server. You get the ability to detect and respond to unusual activities, and that information gets channeled up, centralized, and integrated, so you can have a nice way, not a nice way. I've got my cat and my dog in the window, and they just like came nose to nose. I was like, ooh, don't swat each other. Anyway, you enable, you detect, remediate, and then you can live in a world where you know that you've got that extra layer of protection with Microsoft Defender for Cloud. And again, hey, the link for managed the link for managed instance feature is supported in which versions of SQL Server, right? 16, 19, and 22. And then SQL Server sends changes to Synapse Link to what location? To a landing zone. And then Arc-enabled SQL Server provides what capabilities? I know this is kind of a quiz that kind of is a roll-up of 2 months, right? You've got free inventory of instances, and you've got a best practices assessment. And then Purview policies provide access to SQL Server right? It creates a policy in Purview based on Azure Active Directory accounts. So now we've kind of closed out the connections to Azure section. We talked about linking SQL Server to Azure Managed Instance, linking SQL Server to Synapse, Arc-enabled SQL Server, Azure Active Directory logins, and then using policies for data access and DevOps and pushing those out with Microsoft Purview, and a little bit on Microsoft Defender. Are there any questions, guys? None? Okay. Well, let's break for the Memorial Day weekend, and I'll have the recording posted within an hour. So, and then I'm going to break myself for the weekend. So everybody have a good weekend. I'm going to turn off the recording, and I will see you guys next month.